Hi, everybody. This is Saad for the Sad Truth. Finally, Douglas Murray and I meet. Many of you, I know, have been looking forward to this. I know that I've been looking forward to it. Before I cede the floor to Douglas, I'd like to briefly introduce him. He is an associate editor at The Spectator, associate director of the Henry Jackson Society, and he's written several books, including Bosie, a biography of Lord Alfred Douglas, Neoconservatism, Why We Need It, Bloody Sunday, Truth, Lies, and the Savi Inquiry, and Islamophilia, a very metropolitan malady. How are you doing?
Very good to be with you.
Thank you so much. So I thought we would start with this brilliant word, Islamophilia, because I think it relates to a virus of the human mind that I refer to as ostrich parasitic syndrome. Now, we know that ostriches don't literally bury their heads in the sand, but it's become an apt metaphor to explain how, people can be in such, unbelievable denial toward realities that are otherwise as clear as the existence of gravity. And I think Islamophilia, if you'd like, is a manifestation of this ostrich parasitic syndrome. So maybe you could start us there. What is Islamophilia? Who are those who suffer from this affliction? And we can take it from there. Take it away.
Well, yes, my book on Islamophilia, it's not actually currently available, which is rather annoying. It's undergoing a brief rewrite and a reissue quite soon. But I came up with the term Islamophilia because really, first of all, I've become so bored of hearing what I think of as being its sort of opposite, the word Islamophobia, which had been around for so many years and meant so little, or at least what it did mean was so wrong and so irritatingly wrong. I thought something far more prevalent was not a phobia, certainly not an irrational fear of Islam, but a sort of a weird love of Islam, not by Muslims, but by non-Muslims. It'd be understandable for Muslims to love Islam. It was just rather strange that so many people who were not Muslims, and in many cases seemed to know absolutely nothing about Islam, were so enamored of the religion. And I just have been noticing this for a long time. Everyone from actors and movie stars to prime ministers and presidents who would be critical, and understandably and rightly critical, of any and all belief systems, should there need to be, but who, when it came to Islam, only talked in this sort of slathering of praise and adoration. I mean, I lost count of the numbers of politicians who started in the last 15 years quoting in speeches their favorite bits of the Quran. It's the sort of, why are you doing that?
And of course, Barack Obama said that the most beautiful sound is the call to prayer, right, of the Hazan.
Yeah. There were so many cases of it, and to my mind, it seemed far more prevalent and obvious than, as I say, its opposite. So no, my personal favorite is an exhibition called 1001 Islamic Inventions, which toured the science museums of the Western world, including America and Great Britain and other countries. And this exhibition basically advocated, it was totally anti-scientific, really. It was an act of proselytism by the Muslim Brotherhood, is how it started out. But this exhibition basically posited that Islam had invented the entire world, not just the creation of the world, but everything since. Landscape gardening and also urban planning. Almost all successes of science, cinema. And it did this amazing sort of Soviet-style reverse engineering on history and indeed on facts, and because it was 1001 Islamic inventions, it passed muster. I mean, if anyone had tried to claim that any other religion had sort of been responsible for absolutely every scientific invention, then people would raise an eyebrow and certainly wouldn't hand over the Science Museum in the national capital to such a piece of casuistry. But on this occasion they did. And as I say, that's an example of Islamophilia right in front of you.
I've actually been exposed to this type of thinking in my own scientific work, where someone, usually from that part of the world, or at least of that faith, will write to me to say, oh, but you know that Charles Darwin is not really the guy who should be most known for the theory of evolution. And then they'll cite some guy, and then through some unbelievably circuitous route of mental gymnastics, the real inventor discoverer of the theory of evolution as some guy. But I think this is a manifestation of identity politics. I mean, you see the same thing with African studies, right? Right? The ancient Greeks were really blacks, right? And then so every single group that feels somehow aggrieved rewrites history so that all of the great wonders of the world are really theirs, right?
Yes, and I mean, my favorite example was the rewriting of the Wright brothers, where the Wright brothers were wrong, that they didn't invent flight, but that flight was invented by a Muslim in, I think, the 10th century, or in Andalusia or something. And the actual historical descriptions of this guy is there was a guy who kept on flinging himself off high buildings and falling to earth at an incredible speed.
Right. Or just jumping from any place and committing suicide becomes the invention of flight, right?
Yeah, and it was really strange because they sort of attributed a man who just plummeted a lot. They attributed to him the gift of sort of the invention of flight. And as you say, I mean, the game is to come up with somebody so obscure that sort of everyone's sort of baffled. And because we're all polite, Westerners, if anyone says that anyone else invented anything, we're like, well, sure, it sounds good. Who would I be to produce any counter fact?
So what are
indeed fact?
What are some? I mean, different people are Islamophilic. I suspect for different reasons. And I think you touched on this, although I don't have access to your book. I sort of read a review on it. What are some of the key driving forces that makes people belong to one of the different camps of why they are Islamophilic?
Oh, well, I mean, there's a whole set of things. I mean, for instance, some people do it in order to not look stupid, for instance, so that somebody... give an example. Until 9/11, nobody in the mainstream, in academia or anywhere else, talked on a regular basis about the Islamic Neoplatonists. Suddenly, for the last 15 years, endless summaries of assumptions of people know what they're talking about. And they say, well, of course, arose and so on. And so there are some people who do this because they just want to look really smart. There are others who do it out of a sense of liberal guilt, I would say, a sort of, well, I know all about these Islamic Neoplatonists, and I mean, if you ask them about the Platonists, they might be less confident. But it's a set of those sort of things. Some people, of course, do it to be polite. I think that's the sort of the most noble of them, and I think a good instinct is to show that all sorts of civilizations and peoples have come up with all sorts of things, and I don't want to get into the detail sort of thing. I don't have time for the detail, but sure, if these guys say they invented flight, why not? Right. So it's a whole set of things, and I suppose the worst one is the people who just do it out of really a sense of self-hatred and self-distrust, which is, as the Swedish Prime Minister said a couple of years ago, only barbarism comes from here, and only good things come from outside. That instinct, which is
they exoticize the other, right?
Yes.
As somebody who comes from Lebanon, I see it in sort of my Westerner friends. There's something quite exotic. So, for example, so my mother tongue is Arabic. So for someone whose mother tongue is Arabic, it's not so exotic that I speak Arabic, right?
Right.
It's like being impressed that little children speak French in Paris, right?
Right.
And yet people are they're wondrous when they hear me say 3 words in Arabic. I mean, people get excited because Barack Obama pronounces Pakistan in this way. Well, then they're going to have endless stream of orgasms hearing me speak in Arabic because it just sounds so unbelievably exotic, correct? And
Lucky you.
there you go. Okay, so let's move on from Islamophilia, which again I look forward to when your book is going to be re-released because it's going to be a cracker, I'm sure. When is it coming out again?
If I could tie my publishers down to dates, you could tie me down to them. But I'm hoping in the next couple of months.
Good. All right. Looking forward to it. Let's now turn the attention to, Britain in particular, since obviously you're in Britain, but then we could maybe expand it to the rest of Europe. So things like we hear about the Sharia courts in the British context, Sharia patrols in the streets, the Rotherham cases, the pedophilia rings, the fact that Pamela Geller and Robert Spencer were denied entry to Britain because they are peddlers of so-called hate speech. Which of these stories are accurate? Which are sensationalized? And to the extent that they are accurate, what is going on uniquely in Britain that is different from what might be going on in North America?
I don't think there's anything unique that's going on in Britain that isn't going on in every other country in the Western world. I mean, Canada, America, Western Europe as a whole, we're all going through versions of the same thing. Australia, perfectly a good example of the same phenomenon. Some countries are sort of further ahead, but everyone sees the same sort of things. And I think it's important to keep them in context and keep them under control, as it were, as stories, as well as to be on top of the facts. I mean, one of the difficulties I always, reiterate to people of not being in a particular country is not being able to realize the nuances on the ground. I mean, you hear this a lot at the moment, people talking about France or something. And whilst all of these countries are similar in the things that are happening, all of them have a local context and a complexity, which I do think that means that sometimes there's a sort of coarsening of the actual understanding of what's going on. People get ahead of the story, for instance. Let me take one you mentioned, Sharia patrols. It was true that in East London a few years ago now, a gang of very radical Muslims associated with the now imprisoned Anjem Chowdhury were going around a small part of East London with a self-proclaimed Sharia patrol. Don't drink beer in this area, it's a Muslim area. Now that story, very understandably, not only went into the British press but worldwide, but often less followed up on is the fact that those men were in prison. They were convicted on the Public Order Act for that. And I mean, actually, something quite similar just happened in Germany. Although the people who carried out that so-called Sharia patrol seem to have got off in, I think, the last 24 hours. But these things happen, and they are very, very worrying signs. But I sort of always urge people, don't just pick up the worrying bit and ignore when the state actually answers something, because otherwise, apart from anything else, one has no ability to recognize when the state has also failed. So Rotherham, an example you gave, the Rotherham grooming scandals, sex gang scandals, was a huge. I mean, it was like watching like cutting down a tree and reading through the rings of the growth of a society and its well-being. That scandal took years to come out, saw hundreds of young girls raped and abused by organized gangs of Muslim
you have to
men.
you have to use the euphemism Asian men.
Asian men.
Right.
Yes, of course. Well, that was one of the things. One of the euphemisms, Asian, quite rightly. I mean, Chinese people and others didn't appreciate that. But the reason I say it's like a cross section of a society was that, as we now know from the official report into that, the local police were terrified of identifying this problem and indeed even of investigating it. And similar cases came up across the country. In Oxfordshire, for instance, a very similar case just a few years ago, the Bullfinch case. And it's the same story you see elsewhere. I mean, I can't help thinking that the similarities with what happened in Cologne on New Year's Eve last year, not just because of the attacks or because of the identity of the attackers, but because of the immediate instinct of the police to cover over what had happened, to try not to identify it, because identifying it was scarier than actually dealing with it. And that points to a pathology in our own societies, I'd say. But the same things happen in Sweden, the same things happen in other countries. It's that fear, and it is a very understandable thing on one level, and yet this understandable fear of generalizing about peoples or of tarring a whole community or a whole set of communities with this sort of crime actually meant that men got away with rape. And I think there are things in all of these stories that we can do very little about, and there are things we can do a lot about, and we can do a lot about making sure that civil society and the arms of the state, like the police, are not so browbeaten that they just can't even investigate the rape of a girl.
Well, I mean, my original point about ostrich parasitic syndrome, I mean, is really apt here because it demonstrates how this is really a battle of ideas. I mean, as you probably know, there are many Islamic thinkers and Islamic leaders who've argued that the way that we, and now I'm speaking as one of them, we are going to conquer and defeat the West is through three ways: through using your miserable freedoms against you, through the womb of our women, right, through demographic realities, through fertility rate differences, and then through hijrah, through immigration, right? So these sort of three-pronged attacks are already dangerous, but then you add to that the cocktail of delusional thinking, of parasitized brains that are unable to even instigate a survival instinct to protect their values. Now you've got the perfect storm for what we're seeing in the West, right? I mean, typically throughout evolutionary history, you've got one group of men that want to get to the women of the other group of men, and the thing that's stopping them is that this other group of men are not very keen on giving up their women, and therefore we've got this evolutionary battle that ensures that we will both go out fighting. What's happening in the West is that through this parasitized way of thinking, we are allowing our own demise. We're walking to the abyss of infinite darkness. How do we inoculate people against this endless forms of faux thinking?
Well, there's no one or any easy answer to that. But let me row back a second on one point you made about what you termed the hijra, the mass migration. This is a really, to my mind, I've just finished a book that does come out in the spring on this, which will be announced shortly, on the migration issues of recent years in Europe in particular. And I'm totally obsessed with this issue because I think that there are misunderstandings about it on all sides. And one is that this is in any way an organized movement, that it's organized from where people are leaving from, or that it's organized from the countries that are accepting people. And in actual fact, to look over the post-war up to the present migration into Europe in particular is just a catalogue of mistakes, of failed ideas, of failed politicians, of weakness. It was, after all, Churchill, when he returned in the 1950s as Prime Minister, who oversaw the real beginnings of mass immigration into the UK, and he was a tired premier at the time. And so there's a lot of just human failing in this, and that gets worse and worse as the demographics change, and it becomes harder and harder to address these questions. But as I say, it's an example of a really important part of this. But if one thinks that it's a plot or an organized movement, I think one misses an ability to get to an answer on it, because the explanation is wrong. And so, to come up with answers to this, one has to go right back to the sheer range of reasons why such things have gone on. And, I mean, at a very, very basic level, I'd say that goes from instinctive inherited guilt and a conscience in the West, a sense of history, a sense of liberal humanitarianism, a sense of tiredness, a sense of civilizational ennui, and a whole set of other things, none of which are able to be solved easily, in part because they are actually virtues. I mean, this is one of the problems we always come to. Why is the West so hung over with guilt? Well, partly it's because we know about history and our own history, and who would actually regret that? We wouldn't want to become people who didn't remember history. So I just think that the thing one can do is to get the thinking correct at any rate. I mean, that's why it's worth writing and worth speaking and worth debating these days, is to try to get the thinking correct, not just the analysis, but but and I think increasingly these days that there's a lot of weird sort of party line and very rigid doctrinal thinking on things, which isn't needed. I mean, these things are very, very complex, but the fact that they're complex doesn't mean that there aren't answers.
So in my next book, if I can plug my own book, I will
If
be.
you can't on your own podcast,
Yeah, what's the point? Exactly. Right now, the tentative title is "Death of the West by a Thousand Cuts." Right. The idea is that every small cut is not fatal, but then add them together, then you die. And so in this book, I will hopefully answer the question that I posed to you, namely, what are all the constellation of forces that have led us to be in the state that we're at? Mm-hmm. So I guess one of the things you said, hijra and immigration is something that's important to you, and we need to understand the mechanism to be able to offer solutions. So what would be a solution? So I've often argued that, look, I am an immigrant. I escaped. You may or may not know my personal history. My family we're Lebanese Jews who escaped the brutality of the Lebanese Civil War, and so I'm, perfectly clear about the need for us to be humane and open our doors for people who are fleeing terrible positions. I mean, right? I come from that reality, but on the other hand, I also recognize that not all people who might wish to come to your home as a visitor or as a permanent house member are going to be equally likely to share your values, equally likely to integrate and to assimilate. Yeah. And so somewhere between let's shut the border to everybody and let's open the border to everybody is where nuanced thinking people live. And so how do we strike that balance? Yeah. How do we have that conversation?
Well, it's a very, very important question, the key question. The first thing is the old Irish joke. I mean, we wouldn't start from here. The question you've just asked is a question we should have been asking for decades. And it's one of the biggest tragedies, I think, for our societies that it's only now, when it might be too late, that we are asking the questions we should have asked before day one. I mean, let me just give an example. We've been absolutely confused in Europe in particular about what it was that immigration meant. Did we want the people who came to become like us, or did we want them to be as they were in our countries? And we didn't know. And politicians from right and left simultaneously, and often the same person, contradicted themselves on this. On the one hand, if you asked people to give up any part of their own identity and become like us, this was colonialist thinking or supremacist thinking or something else. And if we said that they could retain their own culture, then it led to all sorts of problems which we've all known about for many years. But, it's only in the last few years that it's become politically acceptable to say, for instance, that if people come to our countries, they should know the language or learn the language. It's an amazing thing after several generations of immigration to say, actually, we'd like you to be able to speak our language. And let me give you another one. It's a bit of a coarse one, but take the example of female genital mutilation. Famous case. It's a lot of publicity these days. I remember when it was very hard to criticize FGM in countries like mine, but this now has almost total political unanimity of opposition to it. And from left to right, Labour Party, Conservatives, main tabloids and the main broadsheets all agree we don't like FGM in Britain. There was a law passed 3 decades ago about FGM. But to date, not one successful prosecution has occurred of somebody who for carrying out or facilitating FGM in the UK. And that's despite more than 100,000 women in the UK having undergone this barbaric procedure. And you see, the reason I give this example is because try to think of something that ought to be an easier battle to win than an opposition to people in 21st century Europe taking a knife to the genitals of a young girl in order to deprive her of sexual pleasure at a later age. I mean, that you should have everybody in that from day one opposing that, from feminists on the farthest left to your crustiest sort of right wing colonel, to use the old cliche. But despite that, it took years and years and years to get any political unanimity, and it still led to no action.
Well, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead. Finish your thought.
No. So I mean, just that augurs incredibly ill for the years ahead. Because I mean, what about the harder things? I mean, no wonder we're struggling with things like Sharia courts and Sharia councils when we're only just there on agreeing that you shouldn't mutilate young girls' genitalia.
Right. Well, I mean, that moral blindness stems, and I think you're aware of this, but maybe some of our viewers might not be. It stems really from sort of a two-pronged monster. Related monsters, cultural relativism, right? I mean, who are we to judge the practices and ethical systems of others? And then associated to that is the political philosophy of multiculturalism, which, of course, the granddaddy of this movement, at least in Canada, is the dad of our current castrato-in-chief, hair boy Justin Trudeau, snowboarder Justin Trudeau, who, by the way, when he was sitting in Parliament, this is before he became Prime Minister, somebody had spoken about many of these practices, honor killings and child brides and female genital mutilations, and had described them using, I think, the word barbaric. And the castrato-in-chief was unbelievably upset that we would use such an offensive word, right? So he wasn't offended or upset by the practices. Rather, he was offended that we would label these as barbaric. Then later he tried to, of course, temper that position when he realized that people were upset by his position. So the fact that somebody could even need to be taught what is the correct position, that it's okay to call it barbaric, is a real problem, right?
But absolutely. But I mean, and I couldn't agree more. But they go back to the initial point I made that we didn't think any of this through. And one sees why we're in this mess. Again, I mean, there are people who think that, all this is happening because somebody planned it, or it's just nobody thought about this. You could see this if you look through any Western country's views on immigration. Nobody expected it to happen. In her 2010 speech that was called "The Multiculturalism Has Failed" or "The Multiculti Has Failed" speech, Angela Merkel said, we've got to admit what we didn't expect to happen. And she said then in 2010, we thought the guest workers, the people who came to Germany from the 50s onwards, we thought that they would go home. Now, I mean, it's a terribly big mistake to make, to import hundreds of thousands of people under the assumption that they were going to come for a brief time and then go back to Turkey or Morocco or wherever. And it took decades to admit that we were wrong in that expectation. And every single step of that way, our political leaders, as I say, I don't think through particularly nefarious reasons or anything, but through incompetence and blind optimism. And I think, by the way, as the philosopher Roger Scruton often says, people forget the enormous damage that can be done by optimists. Right. They because of all of these things, they just didn't think it through. And we're left now, Justin Trudeau is left, and everyone else is left, trying to work a way through this. And there is no easy answer to it, because they've just set us up with this huge conundrum. We're asking questions long after the facts have happened.
But notwithstanding the fact that people might be rosy thinkers and optimists, as you said, I mean, you'd like to think that these folks ultimately, while they're not all Isaac Newton and Charles Darwin, they have sufficiently functioning brains that they're able to react to incoming information that is, again, as clear as the existence of gravity. So someone like Merkel, who, as you said, gave that speech in 2010 and then moved down a trajectory, and now she's pretty much still doubling down on some of her positions. So, I mean, is it just the ugly manifestation of one of the 7 deadly sins of pride, which is I will never admit to being wrong? Is that simply, could that be the answer that explains why someone is so impervious to any environmental input that should otherwise alter your thinking? What's going on? Why are they not reacting to what they're seeing in the trenches?
It must have something to do with that, the pride issue on an individual level. And I mean, when you made a mistake as big as the one I think Angela Merkel made in 2015, you can't suddenly in 2016 or 2017 say, oops, and one can't expect her to. But there's a whole set of things really here, because if you take any of these really large questions like demographics and immigration and so on. I think the most obvious explanation is that it is just enormously tempting to leave it to your successors to deal with. This has been the case, I think, throughout the decades of mass immigration, is that it's such a big issue. And there are issues like this in politics where everyone puts them aside or delays them, kicks them into the long grass because the issue is just too big for an individual to deal with, certainly during this parliament or during this, presidential cycle or whatever. So they just put it off for successors to deal with. And what's so wicked about that, of course, is that it just gets harder and harder and less likely that any successor is going to be able to deal with that in a decent way. And that's one of my big fears at the moment, is that the left and the right, the whole political mainstream, just has kept on failing, and now is surprised that people with sometimes quite radical and sometimes quite unpleasant answers, and often very unpleasant backgrounds, or from very unpleasant movements, are doing so well. And you think, well, if the mainstream hadn't have mucked up so badly and so visibly for so many years, things would be different. But you did. You mucked up.
Right. So are you including amongst examples of those people President-elect Donald Trump as somebody who has bad ideas and so on? Or what's your views on his election, both in terms of the forces that led to him being elected, and what's your personal view? Did you prefer him to Clinton, or what's the situation?
Well, I wouldn't particularly include him in that. There are things I would agree with that he has said, and there's things I very much disagree with. I don't have to be a supporter of anyone, let alone being a British citizen, or British subject, I should say. Look, the thing with Trump is that he's not my ideal president. I wrote about him in the course of the campaign a little. For my taste, I've found that the coarsening of the American political debate, which the left had set running, but which I'd wished that the Republicans hadn't have also fallen into, it isn't particularly to my taste. As I say, I don't have to endorse it. It wouldn't matter if I did any particular candidate. But my own view is that, having expected, I think, like a lot of people, having expected Hillary Clinton to win, at least the next 4 years aren't going to be boring. Which they certainly were going to be under her. We knew exactly what we were going to get with her, and we don't quite know what we're going to get with President-elect Trump. My own view is that, broadly speaking, he's acted as a sort of corrective force in some way. Whether it's a correction to the good or not, I don't know. I find myself in the very strange position of feeling terribly sort of middle of the road, indeed, wet compared to some of the things that certainly on the campaign trail Donald Trump suggested, and I suppose we'll see what he does on some of them. But I tell you, one thing that does strike me on this is that it's a lot of people have said this, but it does seem really clear now that that era of name calling that people tried on him and they tried on other people during the Brexit referendum and others, it sort of isn't working. And whatever else one feels about Trump or Clinton or the recent election, I think it's only to be celebrated that the people who threw every imaginable insult of every type of phobia and misogyny and homophobia and Islamophobia and racism and everything else have just lost again. Because those people really had it coming. And I was so moved when I saw Bill Maher a few days before the election on his show in the US saying, look, we said Romney was a misogynist, racist, and he wasn't. We cried wolf. We said the same thing about John McCain, and actually he's a decent guy, and we shouldn't have said that. But this one really is a misogynist, racist, homophobic, Islamophobic, etc., and he's also a fascist. Well, we'll see. And I don't think he's any of those things. And it's just so striking that the people who did all the name calling must have at least started to realize maybe we can't do that anymore. Maybe it doesn't work. Maybe people see through it. And that it is a great relief if they do.
Right. Here's some anecdotal evidence. And I actually tweeted about this, I think maybe yesterday. I basically said it's been 2 weeks since Trump's victory. Number of faux liberals who have engaged in introspection, zero.
Right.
And the reason why I tweeted this is because I see it on my personal Facebook page, where a lot of my academic colleagues, you would expect them to have thought that Hillary Clinton is wonderful, and Donald Trump, once Donald Trump were to come into power, he would outlaw sex, and he will eat your children, and money would be outlawed, and so on and so forth. I mean, it's really incredible to see the type of hysteria that I was exposed to. It's almost laughable, right? And
Yes.
and the reality is that I've seen no evidence that anyone has engaged in the type of introspection that you and I might expect of otherwise clear-thinking people, in terms of this idea of always feather and tarring everybody as being a racist and Islamophobe. Doesn't work. They are not. They're doubling down. Most of the
But don't you think?
Yeah, go
I mean,
ahead.
but don't I agree? I mean, they seem to be for the time being. But I mean, one observation I'd make is that in politics, I mean, people shift very slowly. Um, I think it's probably like, in a marriage. I mean, if one party is wrong, they very rarely say, "I'm sorry, darling, I was wrong about that." They tend to, let it slide, and then pretend they thought something else all along. I mean, this is how people actually change their minds. They very rarely do they say, "Oh my gosh, I've got it. You were right." They move very slowly, and I suspect that a lot of those people, you're right, a lot of them will double down, hunker down for the duration. A lot of others will realize slowly, maybe, that this isn't the way to do things. And there's one particular thought, if I may say, which is just very striking to me on this, that the America in particular, and American colleges and universities in particular, have made such fools of themselves in recent years. And they've made fools of themselves in front of the whole world. And, I think if there's one thing, again, I don't have much hope it'll happen, but it could happen. One thing that would come from this election in America, like the referendum in the UK and other events of recent years, would just be that people have to stop only speaking to people who agree with them. I mean, it's a maddening thing. It's one of the reasons, by the way, again, I mean, why I wasn't wild about Trump on the trail. As I say, I don't like the form of discourse and debate which he engaged in, albeit it was obviously very successful. But I just think that, people who I disagree with in politics, I have all sorts of explanations for why they do things. I try to speak to them. I try to understand where they're coming from. And crucially, I don't always go in assuming that they've got malignant motives. I often think they've got the wrong information, or they haven't looked at it from this point of view, or so on. But I don't go in assuming that they're Satan. Now, of course, the opposite is not returned. The favor is not returned very often. But if there were anything to come from this, I would just say all those people who are saying, "No, I don't want any Trump voters in my office," or "I don't want any Trump voters in my school," or anyone on my Facebook page. Stop that. Just stop that. Speak to people who have a different point of view, because the unemployed worker in Michigan who'd always voted Democrat but voted Trump this time really is onto something. They really are onto something. They've got a view that a West Coast or East Coast liberal could really do with hearing, and realizing that the person is not motivated by malice but has got a truth, and that it's worth their while accessing that too.
And incidentally, I mean, so to speak to your point about sort of the building of these massive echo chambers, of course, Western universities have become the granddaddy of echo chambers, if only because if you study the political affiliations of those who are imparted with the responsibility of teaching the young minds, they're all of one political leaning, right? So I often will cite a study, but there are many others similar to it, where they looked at the political affiliations of professors in the United States in terms of being Democrats or Republicans, and the ratio across all disciplines was 5-1. Now that sounds like it's not too bad, although that's actually quite disastrous, 5-1. In all the fields that are related to social issues, right? Sociology and women's studies and all the rest of the social justice warrior fields, then you could go up to 44-1 ratio. So imagine the idea that, everybody is striving, everybody who is, I call them faux liberals, is striving for diversity, but diversity of sexual orientation, diversity of skin color, diversity of religion. But the fundamentally most important form of diversity at a university, which is diversity of thought, that's forbidden.
Yeah.
So have different skin shades.
Absolutely.
It's unbelievable, right?
There's a journalism school in Britain. I mean, I don't think there should be such a thing as a journalism school, partly because there's not much journalism, or certainly not many jobs these days in journalism. But there's a journalism school in Britain where the student union the other day voted to ban the Sun newspaper and the Daily Mail.
I tweeted that. Yes.
These are the two best-selling newspapers in the UK. Okay, and they're also profitable. But this journalism school didn't want their students. They didn't want their fellow students to be able to access these things. I mean, look. I mean, there aren't enough jobs going at the Guardian, and they're probably going to be fewer and fewer as the years go by. So not only are these kids doing a course of very dubious worth, a journalism degree in a dying profession, but they're actually making sure that they're incapable of accessing the style, the brevity, the skillful reporting that these papers do, whatever else you think about what they publish or whatever. These are very, very well turned out papers, and a pleasure to write for and a discipline to write for. But this school would be turning out people who can't get those jobs because they've sort of cut themselves off from it. I mean, it's insane. And I mean, the one really hopeful thing is, of course, is that these movements move on, as it were, because they realize that the people they produce aren't employable.
Right.
I mean, literally unemployable students. You did a not very useful degree, and you didn't do it very well. And, I mean, maybe the market will assert itself.
Right. There's a inverted U shape that happens in nature. So let me give you an example. Perfectionism, if you don't have enough of it, then you don't take your work very seriously. You don't have any attention to details. On the other hand, if you're too much of a perfectionist, then you are stuck in an infinite loop of checking to make sure that every single comma is in its place. So somewhere between these two extremes is a healthy level of perfectionism. So a similar argument, I think, could be made for some of these originally, laudable so-called liberal ideas. And I say so-called because, frankly, they're no longer liberal, right? So up to a certain point, being empathetic towards others and, trying to be nice and politically correct is not. But then once you pass that inflection point, then it all goes to hell. And my feeling is, on a collective level, we've hit that point. And the fact that Brexit has come along, the fact that Donald Trump has come along, that is demonstrating that reality at the aggregate level. What do you think of that?
Absolutely. But isn't it well, you see, I'm not a wild optimist generally, but isn't it worrying? If I were one of those people who had spent years hyperinflating the language of human rights and homophobic, transphobic, misogynistic, racist, etc., I would be starting to worry now. I mean, I'm not unworried about this somewhere down the road, because the problem with these people, effectively turning the human rights terminology into a Zimbabwean-like currency, is the fact that eventually the notes all become totally worthless. And what if, and it's not an impossible scenario, what if in Europe in particular in the coming decades, those notes, that currency, becomes totally devalued at the point you might need it?
Right.
I mean, this is something which, if I were, I mean, I'm worried about it as it is, but if I were one of the people responsible for this hyperinflation, I would start to be getting very worried. And I wonder whether in the months and years ahead they might not start to realize this. One very quick example, if I may. I think Hitler claims, wildly overdone. They only come about because about the only historical character anyone knows about these days is Hitler. But so everyone's got to be Hitler. But one of the things from this is all of those people, by the way, from the right and the left. I mean, as I say, I wasn't the wildest fan of Donald Trump when he was running for the presidency of the United States, but I didn't think he was Hitler. I didn't think he was going to reopen concentration camps and so on. But I know a lot of people of right and left, including journalists, commentators, writers, and others, who really did that card. I mean, they really went for it. Donald Trump is the new Hitler, or at very least the new Mussolini, and they were talking seriously about a Trump presidency bringing about basically the opening of concentration camps in the US. You know, we're going to have to flee. We're literally going to have to flee. Well, I ask as a totally serious question to those people, why haven't you left? Why haven't you gone to Canada? Because if I were somebody who honestly thought that my country had just been taken over by Hitler, then I would leave and get my family out. Right. If I think these people should have so much shame for having done this. They have played the biggest card you could play. They have given the biggest siren call you could possibly, early warning call that you could possibly give. And they're sitting in New York.
I've actually, if I may interject, I've actually pathologized this particular condition. So, and some of my viewers have already heard me speak about this, but you may have not, so it's worth me mentioning it again. So there's a disorder, a psychiatric disorder known as Munchausen syndrome, right, where you feign a medical emergency to then garner sympathy. I think a lot of the people who were exhibiting this kind of bullshit, I am so afraid, I'm afraid to go out and buy tomatoes because Donald Trump said something nasty about a woman, therefore they've set up, gang rape centers on the street corners, and I'm afraid to go out. They are actually engaging in this Munchausen. It's a collective Munchausen, right? And the way that I got back at them, and that's one of the powerful things that I can do given my personal history, is that few people score as high on oppression points as I do, given my reality. And so I say, for all those of you who are feeling such existential angst, I wish you would have lived 5 minutes of my life in Lebanon. And guess what? Nobody comes back at me because they really can't fight it, right? You're sitting in your pretty privileged life, truly privileged life at Wellesley College outside of Boston. You've never but you're so afraid to go purchase tomatoes because Mussolini is coming to power. Come live in Lebanon where I fled, right?
Absolutely. And, also, I mean, it's worth going through this for a moment. As I say, I mean, just as a journalist, as somebody who cares about facts, this is worth going through. I read about this a little while ago about the accusation of homophobia against Donald Trump. I said, look, show me the evidence that Donald Trump is a homophobe. As far as I can see, he has the typical views of a New York liberal about being gay. I mean, he's got gay friends. He, would have no problem. He's not particularly interested. Doesn't want to spend his whole life talking about it. But he's not, he doesn't want to change all the laws and make it illegal to be gay again. And yet there are all these people who are pretending that the election of Donald Trump was going to lead to, I mean, that's what the Hamilton stuff against Pence was about as well. That the election of Donald Trump to the presidency was going to lead to the recriminalizing of homosexuality in the United States. Take another one. That tape, again, it was ugly behavior, but the tape from 11 years ago of Donald Trump boasting about what you could do if you're a famous guy and, and so on and so forth. Ugly talk. But there were people who immediately said this was rape. This was legitimate. This was not only legitimizing sexual assault, it was sexual assault. The candidate was a sexual assaulter. And, again, the people who did that, apart from misrepresenting facts, they're now in this ridiculous position. If the commander-in-chief is what you said he was, why, I think these people are going to have to row back. As you say, I think you're right. They'll double down for a bit, but they've got to row back, haven't they? I mean, the claim that he's a racist and that he said all Mexicans are rapists, which again, just go back to what he actually said. You might not like it, it's kind of ugly, but he didn't say all Mexicans are rapists. And so all of these accusations are sort of based on a bogus thing, and they lead to a bogus response. And all these people, if I have a final thought on this, if I may, all these people who do this about, literally shaking or actually crying hashtags and all this. I mean, people who actually go on YouTube to show themselves actually crying and shaking. And they're not being serious. These are not serious people. They can't be. They are performing, as you say.
As a Canadian, by the way, I'm very happy that all those guys, including Michael Moore, did not move to Canada, just as a side thought.
Although, of course, in Canada, you have one of the things that the left in America clearly desires most, which is her hereditary left-wing leadership.
That is true. That is true. So a couple of more points, and then I'll let you go. But of course, I could keep you here for another 5 hours. We have so many things to talk about. We'll have to do it again. Coming back to Islam. So one of the things that some of the folks are trying to do to sort of try to solve this problem is to argue that there is an opportunity to reform Islam in a way that renders it compatible with Western secular liberal democracies. One of whom is a British guy that you know well. As a matter of fact, when I first heard of you was, I think, in 2010 when you had an Intelligence Squared debate, you and Ayaan Hirsi Ali on one hand, and then Khan and Nawaz. So you were arguing about whether Islam is a religion of peace or not, and that's where I'd originally had gotten the pleasure of knowing about you. What are your thoughts on these types of piecemeal approaches to reformation, wherein you take each of the elements in the Sirah and the Quran and the Hadith, and you say, no, this is really what's meant, this is how we could reinterpret it? I think maybe just from my tone, you might get a sense of what I think of it, but maybe you could tell me what your thoughts are on this and whether it's a feasible and worthwhile project.
Well, first things first, I think one of the most regrettable things since 9/11 has been the fact that we've all ended up going at the speed of Islam in theological discussion, in societal discussion, in moral discussion. And I think this is a great shame, because whatever Islam can or cannot do, whatever the trajectory of Islam, should not really be of great concern to Britain, say. I mean, we can't have our own future spent endlessly debating the Hadith. I mean, apart from anything else, they're not very good or interesting. Loads of them are about ridiculous stuff. I mean, I often say to people, I mean, just
that's only because you don't speak Arabic. If you spoke Arabic, then you'd appreciate the nuance.
Yeah, that's right. And all the hadith about what you do with urine on your trousers and semen. I mean, all of those are really, really great in Arabic, and it's just the English doesn't quite work. but it's not a very interesting discussion. I mean, Islam is quite interesting, but it's not that interesting. And I certainly don't want to spend my life, and don't want everyone else in my society and culture to spend their lives discussing Islam. I think as well, in most of the things I care about, Islam is just the slowest kid in the class. And we all end up speaking, certainly have done for the last 15 years, at the level of the slowest kid in the class. And I think it's sort of retarding our entire society's ability to discuss things. I mean, I don't want to talk about whether a woman should be judged in front of an all-male panel of imams in 21st century Britain. I don't want to be discussing. I don't want to be crawling over the Quranic or any other justifications for it. I just don't want it. I don't think it's a wise thing to do in a modern society. So there's that, first of all. The second thing is that I think it's, maybe Islam can reform. Maybe it's all going to go through a brilliant reformation process and so on. But, maybe it won't. And I, for one, don't want my society's future to be predicated on a bet which is likely to be lost. I'd love it if the reformers, and I know, many reformists are Muslims, and, and I wish them well. I really do. I want them to win. But, the history of Islam, as you well know, is that those guys often end up just all being killed, and the literalists win. And, I think that's a tragedy for Islam, but it's not my tragedy. It's not my society. It's not my culture, not my religion. And, whilst wishing them well, I just don't want American society or British or Western European societies to be caught up in that. And I think that is what is happening as we speak. It's what's happening in our societies, as well as speaking at the level of the slowest kid in the class. We're all talking that language. We're all, every ethical discussion, every scientific discussion is becoming, tainted with this. And, all the artistic discussion. I mean, I'm very keen that people know about a lot about other cultures. I'm very keen for that. I like to, do it myself. I'm not a nativist sort of. I don't, I think that only only British food and British literature and British, and I don't think that. I think the world is very, very interesting, but I don't want the entire world's future to be spent discussing Islam. And it just worries me enormously that is what is happening.
But then here's the problem. Sorry to interject. If even though you may not be interested in Islam, Islam is mortally interested in you. And therefore, as the demographic realities change in the West, we can't simply say, you know what, we've had enough of discussing Islam. No. So there is going to be a point at fork in the road. And so the question is, how do we handle that? Some, for example, have argued, right. And I actually raised this with Andrew McCarthy, who was a guest on my show. He was one of the federal prosecutors of the first 9/11. Yeah. You know who he is. He's a lawyer. He's I think a constitutional expert. And I said, do you ever foresee a day when all of Islam, if not some elements of Islam that are problematic, might be rendered seditious? And there is a legal argument to be made that to the extent that there are many elements of Islam that are simply, there's no way you could reconcile them with some of the liberal values that we hold dear and true, then that conversation is going to have to happen. And secondly, when it comes to, say, immigration, my position has always been everybody is welcome as long as we don't cede a single inch of our liberal values, not 1 inch. So you could come in if you're brown, purple, tall, short, fat, or thin, gay or not, as long as you abide by our values. If your beliefs, cultural or religious or others, are inconsistent with that, you're not welcome here. If they are consistent or you're willing to leave them at the door, come in, my brother, and let's live peacefully together. Do you ever foresee a time when politicians will be able to speak in this very clear manner? Because otherwise it's going to be Beirut in 1975 all over the world.
That's a very it's a very disturbing question, but I think that's the way we're going. I have to say, not soon or anything, but look, my own view is that particularly in Europe, where obviously I know most about, I think we're missing the opportunity of a soft landing on this. You see, I've seen in recent years the possibility of having a sort of softer landing on it. Mainstream politicians tackling this. Mainstream politicians also, the importance of not doing certain things. Like the Home Secretary, the former Home Secretary, who's now our Prime Minister, Theresa May. Don't use your Conservative Party conference speech to talk about your favourite passages of the Quran. Just don't do that stuff. And it seems to me that for short-term political gain, people are still avoiding doing the things they should be doing, and holding the lines that you quite rightly describe. And we're getting worse and worse at it. And it seems to me, and I've said this for many years, but that, out way to my side, and I think to yours, an answer to this of another kind grows. And this really worries me. I've said for a long time, if you've got a problem with the existing Muslim communities in your country, not that they're entirely a problem or all a problem, but if very significant problems seem to be coming from them, it doesn't make enormous sense to keep bringing in more people of that same background, because the problem will obviously grow, the number of the proportion to the number of people grows. And this for many has been a very controversial thing to say. I think it's a very obvious thing to say, but it's been a very controversial thing to say. I was saying, slow down, limit the immigration, and you can do something with the people who are here and in time, etc., etc. But now I find myself in this position where, the president-elect of the United States, said on the campaign, no Muslims should come into the US for a period. And I hear that and far more on the continent. And so I find myself feeling, like the sort of wet lefty liberal on some of this. And this, to put it at its frankest, this is very, very troubling. I don't think that everyone on the continent, in particular, who's opposed to mass immigration or anything like that, is a fascist. But we far from it. But we really have to exercise enormous care. And I think because of the name calling and the lack of care and the cowardice and a whole set of other things, we're leaving this job to be done by people that we would not want to do it. And as I say, it's a hard landing will be the only resulting possibility, and that should trouble everybody.
I hear you. Last question. You obviously have the unique personhood that allows you to speak openly and candidly about things that most people are afraid to talk about. And if I dare include myself in that group, and there are a few others, yet most people are not made of that particular cloth, either because they're not sufficiently well informed, or they are well informed, but they suffer from what I call the eighth deadly sin of cowardice. What is some advice that you could give? Because I receive many emails, and undoubtedly you do, where people say, look, I've been inspired by watching your chat with Douglas Murray. I'd like to get involved. I'd like to contribute in my small way to the battle of ideas. What are some recipes that you could offer in terms of how people can get engaged in this discussion?
Well, I think anyone who's sort of listening in any way is obviously engaged already. I mean, anyone who's interested in reading what some of us write or listening to what some of us say and so on is obviously already engaged. It's not terribly easy to answer this question. I mean, it's much easier to diagnose problems than it is to propose solutions to them. I'm not a politician, so and by the way, for my sake, that's an advantage. I mean, I can say whatever I like. But I do think that the only answers that exist here, there are no new answers to this. The only answers that exist are ones that have already been there. That people should. I mean, this is an obvious thing to say, but if you're concerned about politics, join a political party or join the party that is most similar to your views, and argue your views within that party. If I thought of there's a weird thing that's happening in the world of multimedia and the internet and everything, which is that, as PJ O'Rourke once said, everyone, I've quoted it many times, everyone wants to save the world, but no one will help mom do the dishes. I think people should act locally rather than globally. Look after what's around you. Look after the ones close to you. Influence and speak with the people you come across. All of that. I mean, far more important than starting a blog is speaking to the person standing beside you. And that's sort of what people seem to be losing, it seems to me. And the other thing, I suppose, again, a really basic thing, but I think that this thing of talking across the lines is so important now. It's probably never been more important. And realizing that another party that has different views from you is generally not evil and is generally not, doing it for nefarious reasons, but has other points of view. And I think that the reintroducing civil discourse around some of this, the people who say to me, God, I wish I could say what you say, or things like that, and I get that quite a lot, often from people in professions who, worry, and sometimes worry quite rightly about the impact on their careers, sometimes forget that, I mean, a lot of this is just talking about things with people, and to my mind, just defanging the whole area. I mean, people say to me quite often, God, I thought of doing this, but I'm really worried about saying that. And, and I always say to people, well, we'll say it, or have that conversation, or write that, and most of the time, nothing happens. It's absolutely fine. I think we've internalized a sort of fear in our societies, which we should just shrug off. I mean, there is no reason why we can't say what we think about religion or about politics, and just to have the discussion as we've been having this last hour, to have a discussion freely and without fear and without, thinking we're going to be Kalashnikoved at any moment. Just that's normal. This is normal.
I want to build on what you said, and then we'll wrap it up, because I've got a great personal anecdote that speaks to that fear that people have internalized, which results in them engaging in the dreadful reality of self-censorship, right? So when we moved from Lebanon to Canada, and my mother and I would speak sometimes on the phone, she would speak in code because she still had the reflex that there might be the mukhabarat, the sort of the secret service of Syria listening in. And we had to remind her that, no, Mom, don't worry, we're now in Montreal, Canada, right? And so this internalized fear becomes, if you like, a form of paranoia where you can't shut it off. And so to your point, most people overestimate the amount of damage that might happen to them. Of course, there are threats. Look, I take great personal and professional risks for being outspoken. But yet, in my reality, I fear more my own moral guilt if I don't speak out, right? So in my case, I've done the calculus, and not speaking out is a worse reality than speaking out and facing the consequences. And so I think if everybody were to sort of move along that calculus, and as you said, locally, just chat on Facebook, right? Somebody says something that you disagree with, don't be afraid, don't self-censor. Already that will change the zeitgeist that we are experiencing, correct?
Absolutely. And also, I mean, who would want to be lying on their deathbed and think, well, I think I got through that okay?
Right, beautiful. Any last plugs that you'd like to plug right now? I know your forthcoming book. Anything else that you'd like to share with us that's not public yet?
My new book comes out in the spring with Bloomsbury Publishers, and I'd love to chat again then. And otherwise, people can read my blog at the Spectator magazine in the UK, spectator.co.uk, where I write about a lot of things, including things we've been talking about. And otherwise, very much look forward to hearing from your readers, and I doubtless will hear from many of them. I'm on Twitter as well. What's my Twitter?
Douglas K. Murray.
Exactly.
I will put it in the descriptor. You are a true delight and a true gentleman. Absolute pleasure chatting with you. Stay on the line for a second. Thank you so much for coming on, Douglas.
It's a pleasure.